and then our wonderful panelists will give some feedback, and then we'll open it up for discussion. But first, I would like our wonderful panelists to just give a very brief introduction and how they came to be involved and interested in this topic. So I'll start with Professor Chatti from the University of Oxford.
I find it hard to try to speak in public and
Maybe we don't need to translation, I think. I'll talk to understand Sorry.
All right, well, I think age gives me the privilege of going back into a bit of history. My first engagement with development agencies was in 1978 in Syria, when the United States government, the Agency for International Development, was very interested in assisting the Syrian government in getting the sheep off the steppe land. They had huge projects for wool collection, washing of wool, factories, sheep fattening, and they wanted me to encourage the Bedouin to get rid of to reduce their animals on the grounds that they were degrading the steppe land. At that time, I didn't really want to get engaged in that because I couldn't see where they came up with this idea, and I say it's an idea and a philosophy, that the Bedouin herders were degrading the steppe land. At that time, I asked, and I didn't get any answers where their evidence was. And so it took another 20 years when I was again engaged with a different UN agency in Syria in 1994, 1995. And they were trying to remove the Bedouin from the desert. And at that point, when I said, what proof do you have that this is degraded by human use? And they took me out to show me areas where they suggested there was degradation. I said, where's the evidence? Where's the proof? They didn't have any. So I went and I started looking at aerial photographs of the same region that had been conducted in the 1920s during the French colonial period. And I located aerial maps of the same region, printed them, showed them that there was no difference in the grass cover between 1920 and 1990. To me, that was empirical evidence that there was no degradation. But the UN said, well, we're really sorry, but this is what the government wants, and the UN works with governments and not with independent scholars, etc. So my position is that this philosophy of degradation is part of the move to try and develop and modernize along Western lines areas that have different kinds of life paths, whether you call it traditional or alternative. And it's sad that this vocabulary still exists. Of course, there are areas that are degraded, and you can see that when herders are squeezed off of their land, pushed into a corner of their land, unable to really move their animals from low resource areas to another, depending upon grass cover range, etc., etc. But by and large, it's a philosophy that has no empirical backing. It's just a way forward because that's what a lot of development planners want. Let's leave it at that.
So I'm Troi Stэрnberg, and I read a book called Desertification, Exploding the Myth, written by two professors at Oxford, Dave Thomas and Nick Middleton. And later, when I wanted to be a PhD student at Oxford, they became my supervisors. So already they were trying to physically identify desertification, separate it from degradation, and what the forces are, both social and physical. So as part of my PhD, I was doing work in Mongolia, and even in the 2000s, there was this raging debate. 80% of Mongolia is desertified by that jargon and these things. But I wasn't seeing it unless I went around the Gobi. So my professor said, well, think about how you might investigate it. So I did it with them, and we wrote some papers on desertification. They're online, and you can contact me. So it was my practical experience, hearing how bad Mongolia was, and then going into the Gobi and seeing, even in the desert, I didn't see this great destructive force. So realizing that it was more complicated than simply, was there grass or no grass? And one thing I always like to emphasize, we call it the Gobi Desert, so you can't desertify a desert. I mean, it's already, desert is in the name, so they need to separate many of these factors. And today's a great opportunity to do it. And the Mongolian people, you should also tell us how you perceive it and what it means to feel Mongolian, because we're all outsiders.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, hi, I'm Eric Trifт. I'm from the University of Winnipeg in Canada. I'm coming to all of this from the discipline of anthropology. I've worked in Mongolia for about 25 years now altogether, and my own research doesn't focus specifically on degradation. It's on culture, basically, right? And the idea of, or the will to preserve and safeguard cultural identity and cultural practices. But also more importantly, and I think this is speaking to Don's comments as well, the forces and structures and initiatives that can, in some cases unwillingly, some cases deliberately, threaten those practices, and how this can become a sort of politically contested space. In other words, sort of language around development and modernization, rangeland degradation, while kind of couched in often in very technical and sort of neutral sort of language, often is very, very political, and sort of underneath the surface we see different types of resistance and alternative ideologies and power dynamics at play. And so this has really been the core interest for me, looking at these issues anthropologically. In other words, not whether or not degradation exists or whether or not culture itself is something of value, but how these representations of value and representations of truth come to us through very, very political and socially embedded structures. So we'll have more chance to talk about that in the panel, I think.
Oh yes, so my name is Airiel Ahern, and I'm also a hematogeographer, and I've worked extensively with herders, lived with them, conducted and participated in pastoralist livelihoods, and I'm interested in social organization and the political economics of pastoralism, which I think others in this room are interested in. Dan Murphy having written many great articles about this topic as well. So I think that one of the goals for us here today is not to say degradation exists or it doesn't exist. That's not the goal. It's to say let's think critically about this discourse and look at it from different angles. And I think that doesn't happen very much in Mongolia, so we're trying to create this opportunity for dialogue and discussion and maybe thinking about things differently. So like Troy said, we're open to new ideas. There's ecologists that we talk to a lot, and desert scientists, and we're going to offer some of their views in this PowerPoint. So again, it's not a war. We're not trying to instigate a war, we're trying to open up this space for critical dialogue. So the agenda for today will be I'll give you a little bit of ideas for the goals that we have, but we really want to encourage interdisciplinary critical analysis. So also to encourage more collaborations between physical scientists, ecologists, social scientists, political scientists, geographers, because all of these perspectives help us understand factors underlying concepts, how we understand change, how we understand environments, and all these things. We'll discuss some of the recently published literature focusing on grassland degradation in Mongolia. And then, luckily, because Troy's here, he's done a lot of the measuring and he produced a lot of articles on this topic. So how is degradation generally measured? What kind of data is used? What are maybe some, what can it reveal to us? What kind of things can it offer us and help us with, but also what the limitations might be? And then also to think critically about this from more anthropological perspectives, from historical perspectives. So in terms of this session, it came about because last year we had a summer school for social science research, in which we had many people that came and we discussed research design and methods. And land degradation kept coming up as an example. How do we know this? Where's the evidence? Let's think about data. So it was a point by which we could think about things critically, which was important for thinking about new research design, how we design new projects. So we see this as kind of a continuation of those activities, because we really want to also emphasize for young researchers in the room, the importance of critical analysis and critical engagement with academic publications, including our own publications. So I can defend my publications, but obviously we need to be able to think about the limitations of those also. And then this is a chance to think about these contemporary issues with policy relevance, something that academics sometimes don't have time to do, but this is a great space to do that. So, so what's critical analysis engagement? I think we're expecting more younger researchers maybe to be here. You guys all know this. But yeah, the importance of reading multiple perspectives and studies on one topic. And sometimes we get into our own narrow frame of thinking. That's why I love being in a geography department, because I'm surrounded by physical scientists, water scientists. I'm kind of an anthropologist, so we can debate in a friendly manner these issues. So that's very helpful for me. But I think many people get siloed perhaps into their own niche, and there's not enough chance to talk about other data, other methods, and to be more innovative or creative in the approach. So Troy, I'm going to hand over to you to talk about what are drylands, how do we understand them, because we're talking about degradation in dryland environments.
Great, it's great to be here. Thank you, Ariel and Moku, for this idea. When we talk about drylands, it goes beyond deserts. So often when I say I work in deserts, people think I work on sand dunes. But drylands around the world, more than 2 billion people live in these areas. It's about 40% of the Earth's surface. So they're very large, and they encompass cities from Los Angeles, California, to Cairo, Egypt, and Baghdad, and many parts of China. So it's very large. So that's why the debate can have much impact. What we use more scientifically is something called the aridity index, and so that's a measure of how much precipitation you have, and that's actually going to feed the vegetation on the ground. So it's how much precipitation, and with evapotranspiration, how much evaporates. So if we're in a place with much sunshine and it's 40 degrees, we'll have high evaporation rates. So a set amount of precipitation will not be as nourishing for the ground. So Mongolia is quite good, I think, because often it's cool, like today, so you don't have the same high evaporation rates. So 200 millimeters of precipitation in Mongolia might be more beneficial for your vegetation than in the Middle East or Africa. So these are just some context, some standards we use, and so Mongolia's been mapped, the whole world's been mapped, and you can kind of see where you might fit in compared to other places. So it's a bit of data to help support our research. High variability, and this goes with non-equilibrium. So Mongolia has over 30% variability. So that means from year to year, we might have much precipitation or not very much. The climate may change as well, the temperatures. So we come from the UK, from Oxford. It's a very low variability place. And so we get 1,100 millimeters of precipitation a year. But if one year we get 1,200 or we get only 900, there's going to be plenty of grass growing for the sheep to eat. So Mongolia doesn't have that luxury. So as I was talking to the gentleman about Zud last winter, in his area of Mongolia, maybe it didn't happen in another area because Mongolia is so large. So there's variability. We cannot count on our systems to always be the same. So when we make policy or infrastructure, best if it can be adaptable. Low moisture, the importance of that, of course, is we need moisture for vegetation growth, and if we're talking about pastoralists, they need vegetation for the animals to eat. So it's very important in this system. And here, one of the main forms of precipitation will be snow. And as I was told just a few minutes ago, when the snow melts, that's one of your main sources for moisture for your pasture to grow in the spring or early summer. Also, soil quality. So rain alone, precipitation alone won't be enough to turn your desert into a garden. It also depends on the soil quality, and that varies. So if you have poor soils, not so much will grow. If we look across the border in China, the poor soils of their part of the Gobi requires much fertilizer when they're trying to have mass production of crops. So it's a combination of these many things, and what we see is deserts and drylands around the world are quite diverse. So if we went from here to California in the U.S., it would look very different, and the human element, the infrastructure, the policies that shaped it, the money, would create a very different environment full of swimming pools. If we might say that's not very efficient, but that's one approach to drylands. We went to Africa, the Maasai region, that we saw some talks on yesterday, we're going to see something else. So Mongolia is one part of a global system that has high variability, and we're going to see different aspects in different areas. And also Mongolia being a cold desert will have more in common with Tibet and USA and Canada in some parts than maybe parts of China or nearby in other parts of Asia. And next. Okay, climate dynamics, hydrothermal regimes. It's a busy word, but we can just break down. Hydro means water, thermal is heat. Okay, so what's the nature of the environment? So now Mongolia is warming up. Yesterday we saw this great rainstorm during lunchtime. Today it's overcast, but we're never going to have very much water in UV. It's just not set for this region. It doesn't have the physical characteristics or setting for it. Thermal, I always remember Mongolia, once it was -40 in UV, and so it's always going to be cold. And when people talk about global warming in Mongolia, I see it a little differently. If it warms up a little bit, what if Mongolia has a longer growing season? You know, if we have 110 days of growing instead of 100 days, there should be more vegetation. So maybe a little warming temperature might have a better impact in Mongolia than what we might expect in Africa, where it might mean there's going to be less vegetation. So every place will be somewhat different, and Hove is going to be different than Dorn, different than Gobi or Wolgan, I imagine. So you have such a large country, you have to be aware that you'll have different regimes in different areas. Wind, a big issue, particularly in springtime in the Gobi region. It's the wind and the dust that in trains is very well known in China, but also in Korea and Japan. And in Japan, the Totori University has a monitoring center on their rooftop just for dust from Mongolia and China. And there are ways to track the source of the dust, but I noticed Mongolia and China haven't really pursued that, because China always blames Mongolia. Mongolia can't say anything back, sort of. But we could define more, but the point is there's lots of dust, and now there's so much that there's also tracking stations in Oregon and the U.S. that the U.S. monitors to see what these international dust flows are. Regional variability goes with a hydrothermal. So do you have a high altitude landscape? Are you in a valley surrounded by mountains? Mongolia and Central Asia, parts of Siberia, very continental, very far from moderating factors from ocean currents. So that again will affect your environment. And then always water, precipitation. One of my research efforts before was water and resources in the Gobi, and I was really surprised to see that through much of Ongov, the water table was very shallow. So 2 to 3 meters, herders could access water in these shallow aquifers. So for me, that was quite impressive. But a gentleman just today told me in Dorna, it's 75 meters. So we have very different regimes in the same country. But water, of course, key to life and for animals, which often is a discussion topic in Mongolia. Is there enough water for your herds? And Aerial and I were doing some research in Hanbok, and instead of saying, is there water for my animals, they had it otherwise. I think for the number of animals I have, there isn't enough water, so that's an environmental problem. But somebody else might say, maybe you have too many animals for your neighborhood. So these things are ongoing debates, and we can talk about it more later in our discussion. I'm sure you have many opinions. But these are finite things. There's only so much water. And once I was at the meeting of the government, they wanted to divert the Hurlin River from middle of Mongolia down to Oyu-Tolgoi. So if you take water, you move it one place, you won't have it somewhere else. So there's a finite supply. We're not next to the ocean. So we have to consider this in our debates and particularly in our planning.
Okay, great. So basically one thing that to really emphasize here is that climate change is impacting Mongolia. It's having effects that are still being understood. So often we hear constantly, I hear it constantly, there's 70 million livestock in Mongolia, it's causing degradation. Everyone seems to think of this as a direct causal relationship. But science and many articles have shown that it's extremely complex. That climate change is having impacts on these hydrothermal regimes, on wind, on water, and that also affects how much vegetation is on the ground. And what we'll talk about later is the way we measure vegetation often is through remote sensing. And that's a very, in some ways, sometimes crude way of looking at vegetation because you can't really see what's happening on the ground in detail. So we'll talk about that more in a little while. But I think it's important to think about climate change because we don't often say, degradation is happening in Mongolia because of the climate impacts. And what other areas of the world are observing are these climate impacts, and they're telling huge emitters like the United States that they should give climate reparations because Mongolia has not contributed to causing climate change. They're actually being highly impacted. So maybe we can think differently about degradation and think differently about the politics behind it as well. And another point just to make is that Mongolia also contributes to climate change through coal production. But we don't say mining causes degradation, yet there's almost 3,000 licenses in Mongolia for mining. So it seems to always be a causal relationship between livestock numbers and degradation. So here we're kind of trying to probe that issue. So in terms of desertification, this is Professor David Thomas, a prominent professor in our department of geography. And for the lecture to students in our department, he says, at first glance, desertification is a straightforward environmental issue. Land degradation caused by humans that leads to the expansion of desert-like conditions. In reality, though, it is proven to be a controversial and complex issue. Non-human and human agency have been confounded. Crisis narratives have ascribed blame on certain societies and land use practices. Permanency of change has been conflated with variability. Extent, occurrence, and causation have both been exaggerated and opaque. Global and local solutions have been debated, and natural and social scientists have been at odds in an often highly politicized arena. And this is coming from a desert scientist. He's not a social scientist. He works exclusively on desert environments, and he wrote this book, Desertification: Exploding the Myth. So this is, he's coming to this from a very critical perspective, and the article that we handed out, he's one of the authors on it. So what is desertification? Desertification refers to this land degradation that involves at least one of three long-term losses: biological productivity, ecological integrity, and the land's value to humans in arid, semi-arid, and dry subhuman areas caused by climate variations and human activities. So we can see that it refers to this kind of different types of losses related to land degradation. So we want to think through some of the articles that have recently presented perspectives on land degradation, and they offer very different perspectives. So we thought it would be useful to think through these different perspectives. And Troy has been reading this one at length, so I think I'll hand it over to him to present what this article is talking about. The article is called Research Progress of Desertification and Its Prevention in Mongolia. I think Muko sent this around on the Facebook page. This is just sort of a very brief kind of overview of it.
So this is a recent article, 2021, by we see Chinese and Mongolians claiming that more than 76% of Mongolia has been degraded. And what were the methods? A review of articles, and then the data used, these are published academic articles, and what we would say, there's no field data, and what about the scale and of remote sensing? And to go into a little more detail, they review several articles, but the first issue for me is that many of them, the majority are in Chinese, in a Chinese firewall, only available in China. So for me, this tells me it's not robust and repeatable because I cannot read these articles to see what they say. I don't even know if they are articles. They might be government reports, they could be blogs. There's no knowledge, so it's a black hole. So I don't really know what they're talking about. Then how do they come up with 76%? Because I read the article, and you should read the article for your own critique and see if you agree or you think they make their case or not. For me, I want to know more about what these people are saying and how they came about to say it. Another immediate point that I noticed is we see 3 Mongolian authors. So my assumption was that the Mongolians were doing the research and the Chinese were supporting and doing the writing. However, that's not the case. So if you read the back of the article, it describes each person's role. The Mongolians did no writing, no research, and only review of the paper. So for me, this is window dressing. So do they really know about Mongolia? And nowhere in the paper does it say they even showed up in the country. So these are people, we would say it's like armchair research. So they're in the universities, reading papers, coming up with their statements. So he might be right, he might agree, or not. But I think we should at least need to question it, because for me, we have many scientists in the room. I'd rather talk to you and see what you think about degradation and desertification in Mongolia. The interesting thing as we go through it, they cite one of my articles, and their conclusion or their inference from my article is different from my inference. So if mine is if at odds, what about the other 60 or 70 papers they're citing? So instead of mine, it's available online, or I can send it to you. Instead of saying there was little evidence of desertification in 2 field sites, they're like, I did not say there was irreversibility, which is a much different statement. And the other thing that we should point out is, see, my paper was in Overhangай and Omagov. So that's just two small places in a vast country. So my conclusions was just in this area, this is what we can say, but only today. You know, it was in 2010, so I'm sure it's changed a lot. So that starts raising questions. If I have questions about what I know, because I wrote it, what about these other articles that are out there and that they're engaged with? As Ariel said, they're using remote sensing, most of the articles, and we need to think about what is remote sensing, what does it really tell us, and at what scale. So mine in 2010, we were looking at the environment in 1 kilometer segments. So that's quite basic. It's not very refined. So all I can say is in this area, a general appraisal would lead to this. Then another article I did was we were able to go to 250 millimeters, and some of these would be at 30 millimeters. So that's much better. So we need to question this, but also we need to question how applicable and extendable it is when you're doing this research. So I would say my research would not be valid for Dornard or Solange, because they're much different environments. And so I try to say that in the paper. This paper does not say that. So can there be a remote sensing of all of Mongolia? I would question that to see how do you get that much complexity into some images like that. So what about the scale of the remote sensing? What about the timing? Remote sensing's been around in some form since the late 70s. The David Thomas article was from 2000 to 2020. This article is some were just one season, 1 year. But the question is, for us, do we think the authors made the article? Do we agree or disagree? Do we accept it? And for me, there's not enough detail in the paper for me to say they've answered the question about desertification in Mongolia. And even what do they mean by progress? And what do they mean by desertification? It's not really clear in this paper. So I prefer Ariel's short statement about this human impact. And also, when we talk about it, it's the permanent loss if we're going to have desertification. We have degradation, and with rainfall or other conditions, there may be a change, and we may see increase in the amount of vegetation cover. So there's much flexibility, and that's what we have to be aware of. And if I were the editor, I would ask more questions about this, or maybe have them state clearly that they did not come to Mongolia, they did not do any field work, and this is one version of a select amount of literature that I personally would not have access to. So I could not cite that paper because I don't know what they really did. So we have to ask these questions, and that's part of the critical thinking that Ariel is leading us to.
I just have not necessarily a question, but a comment. I guess it kind of comes down to, how good of a journal this is, right? And what have they published? What else do they publish? How long have they been published? I mean, there's some journals that have been out there for a number of years, are more, more respected, I guess. So these days you got to kind of look at journalist things.
That's a great point. In this is sustainability. It's got a 3.9 impact factor. So it ticks boxes, but is it good? And do they really look at land use? Do they really look at land use as part of their remit, or are they just trying to fill out a special issue or something? That we don't know. But that raises the point again. If the majority of the papers are in Chinese that I can't read, I know they're not in a peer-reviewed international journal, so that lessens my faith in them. But these are the questions we need to ask and investigate.
Okay, thank you, Troy. So thank you, Troy, for that cutting review. Also, I think it highlights the peer review process that we often have to go through to get articles published, and a great point about the types of publication venues. So another article which basically says the exact opposite of that article that we just talked about is called Divergent Processes and Trends of Desertification in Inner Mongolia and Mongolia. We handed this out. And this is also by several Chinese authors, and also David Thomas contributed to this. And the main argument was that actually the desert has shrunk in Mongolia, and that the causes of change are highly related to climate variability. And actually, the low impact mobile pastorals in Mongolia has had far less impact than in China. And interestingly, I think a great contribution to this article was they talked about degradation also in terms of urbanization. In China, there was a lot more urbanization, which led to a reduction in rural population. So the human impact in the rural areas was less. So there's also sort of more growth of grass in Inner Mongolia. So it was they added a new element, thinking about urbanization as a factor within this debate. And how does that play a role in these processes? Maybe, removing populations and allowing more kind of wild grass to grow, or also perhaps urbanization as a cause of degradation as well. So what the argument is that the desertified area of the Mongolian plateau has decreased by 75%. This is including Inner Mongolia. In Mongolia, it has decreased by 25%. And they use remote sensing again, which we know has limitations. Precipitation data, Google Earth, and other, this general linear model, which I honestly don't know what that is. So I need to study more about this. But it was interesting to me that we have two articles published in about the same period of time, the last couple of years, that actually show very, very divergent arguments and divergent results, which again allows us to think critically about this. Okay, so we have a general discourse about degradation in Mongolia linked to overgrazing, but here we have several articles which show extremely divergent views on this. So one thing that was really interesting about this article as well, which we'll highlight later, is again the emphasis on climate change that they talk about in this particular paper. That actually the climate variability has the closest direct relationship with measures of vegetation. And so, again, I don't want to just say, yay, this is great, and oh, that's bad to know, but okay, let's think critically about this one too. What are the limitations to their data? What scale are they able to look at? Again, this is quite a big scale that they're trying to make claims about, so we can also think critically about this. So we can apply this critical lens to all the articles we read. But they also can do field research. They relied pretty directly on this data, which has to do with remote sensing, precipitation data, Google Earth satellite sort of analysis. So it's also limited by this issue. Okay, Troy's article on contraction of the Gobi Desert. This is maybe has a middle ground view on what's happening. So Troy, can you speak to this article a little bit? So you've written in 2015, which was a bit before the other articles.
So I was inspired by a paper written in, I think, 1989 about the Sahara Desert, when the desert was supposed to be swallowing the country of Sudan. So
so we kind of took that to Mongolia and found there were striking parallels between the vagueness in defining the Gobi and the imprecision and controversy surrounding the Sahara Desert southern boundary in the 1980s, 1990s. So this is an issue that's globally been going on for 40 years in an academic remote sensing sense. But one thing we found that I thought was interesting was improved boundary definition between arid and semi-arid has implications for understanding desert greening and desert browning, human action and land use, ecological productivity, and changing climate parameters in the region. So we were kind of looking at, are parts of the Gobi getting greener or are they getting browner? And so we found it wasn't necessarily in the desert outer ranges, but that within the desert, what we might say hyper-arid in some small parts, the arid and the semi-arid, those boundaries were fluctuating. While at the edge of the desert, that was shrinking because in our conclusion, it was precipitation. The interesting thing when I finished this and I presented this in China, because the desert was shrinking, all the Chinese researchers told me that was great government policy. But if I went back 5 years later, it was expanding, they would have told me climate. So it's very interesting how people interpret that to suit their own agenda or perhaps funders, things like that. So it's something we can do in the Gobi. I recommend that we should do it in other countries as well, other regions, Africa. And the key thing is the aridity index from 2000 to 2012. So you might say, this article's outdated now. This information is for one period of time only. And maybe there's better remote sensing tools now. Maybe if we had a longer time period, like that Thomas article, we might find something different. So I'd say this is a snapshot that shows the Gobi is contracting, but it's then, and you might go write an article that would say, sorry Troy, it's changed since that period of time.
Thanks, Troy. So that's really helpful to think about the definitions of boundaries and time and to the extent to which that can be generalized into the future. Because of all this change that we see, and also changing tools that we have. Remote sensing has improved, I guess, a lot in the last 30 years or so. Just to kind of summarize, I got really excited personally. I think you guys can understand which side of the debate I'm on. This Wow et al. Article says the conclusions they reached was grazing intensity in both Mongolia and Inner Mongolia has increased from 2000 to 2017. Okay, but it appears to have had different effects on desertification, which may be due to different grazing methods. While livestock numbers have risen in Mongolia, traditional nomadic practices remain dominant, and this extensive approach limiting pressure on the landscape. Though at shorter annual timescales, pastoralism itself may be impacted by events such as drought and frost that are not captured within our longer-term analysis. Livestock numbers are not in themselves a significant contributor to desertification or desert extent changes across the region. So again, they're emphasizing thinking critically about these timescales and also thinking about this wider range of factors, including urbanization and climate change. So now Troy is going to tell us more about what remote sensing can measure and what its limitations are, since he's used it and also critiqued himself helpfully in maybe the sort of outdatedness of his last.
Right. So right. We should acknowledge and appreciate that. So remote sensing, if you just think of satellites flying around the Earth at different time patterns, a day, a week, whatever, and they take snapshots everywhere they go. So basically, we're comparing snapshot photos of Mongolia over weeks, months, years, whatever time scale you choose. So in my research, we were using the summer months when there should be the most vegetation growth. So if we did something in the winter months, we would say Mongolia was like Antarctica, it's just a white blanket of snow. So we wouldn't learn very much. But it's a reflectance, the satellites emit, and what comes back, what reflects back to the satellite, and then it gets processed to give us information. And the big one for vegetation is the NDVI, normalized vegetation index, differential vegetation index. So it tells you about the greenness of the landscape. But what you have to be aware of is that it doesn't tell you what the landscape is. So this is at the Minqin County Desertification Center in Gansu, China. And I was most amazed that they would show us this as a representative of their anti-desertification campaign in China, because it's nothing but plastic shrubs. So for them, the headquarters in Beijing only saw it as green reflectance on their imagery, so they were doing a good job in battling desertification. So as a researcher, you go, this will have no effect on desertification, and it's probably going to pollute the environment when they eventually blow away. So just be aware of that. It's not a solution to everything, it's just one measure. It's a neutral machine measurement. And what it can do is, in the remote sensing, can tell us about vegetation, water, open land, urban land. There are many categories that it can address. And now I'm sure you could even have many subsets of this as they get ever more refined. But it doesn't tell us what's happening on the ground. So that's where we need ground truthing. We need someone to go out there and say, it's plastic. Or maybe it'll be, actually maybe it'll be much better, maybe it'll be growing. But the other thing we need to remember is, even if we have greenery, do the animals want to eat it? Is it some invasive species that looks lovely, or is it something, some forbs that the animals can actually process and is useful? Then we mentioned this earlier, this time and scale. I've also helped some people write a paper on desertification around the world, but how do we know what's happening all around the world? Because it's just numbers and data that's generated. So we might have an idea, but we really need to talk to Mongolians or talk to Maasai to know what's happening there. And I really suggest going and what we would say ground truthing, so you know if it's plastic or not, or if the vegetation is really there. And as we've mentioned, the seasonal variation depends on when you look. So if we were going to Kenya with our talks, we could do it all year, or we might want to do it during the rainy season and during the dry season. We would probably see two different things. That would be interesting and give us some information. But that wouldn't be relevant to Mongolia because it's really the cold season and the warm season.
Okay, so this is kind of concluding what we were talking about. So basically, okay, critical perspectives. We've talked about all these critical views. Troy in particular gave a very critical review of one of the articles. So thinking about soils, what can actually grow in these locations. We have highly variable, non-equilibrium environments. Climate change is having a big role, big impact in Mongolia. Should we think differently about those impacts? Maybe Mongolia deserves climate reparations. Maybe the focus should be on that rather than saying we have to intensify agriculture and take pastorals off the land. So we can think really critically about the role of climate change. Because if actually climate change is causing degradation, then it doesn't matter how many rangeland management projects we have, climate change is going to be the major cause of that degradation. So how do we reverse climate change? That's a political issue. Is Mongolia going to stop producing coal, which is also causing climate change? So these are things that are not ever discussed in relation to land degradation, but those do cause land degradation indirectly through the contributions to climate change, which are affecting Mongolia pretty drastically. And then also we have these other socioeconomic perspectives, which I think probably many of you have already written about yourselves, but I want to turn to Довн and Eric to think about some of those wider perspectives from a historical or socio-political perspective. So I'll hand over to, is it okay if I hand over to Eric first and then Довn?
Okay.
Yeah, is that okay?
Do you have the notes?
Oh, you're yes.
Okay.
But yeah, it's okay.
You don't need to put them on the screen.
Technology. That's a tech guy.
This is really called speaking of that. I was just thinking to myself, what would I want to start by talking about? Again, I'm going back to the area that I know, which is of course the semi-arid steppe land of Northern Arabia, and of course the very arid desert in Oman on the edge of the empty quarter. And I was just thinking about the interaction between the herders and the Western development experts. And what I was thinking about was the way in which very often development experts are attempting to improve conditions, but they're coming from a very different mindset and different mind frame. In Syria, for example, a great deal of pressure was put on to the herders to change the type of sheep that they were herding. The region was famous for its Awasi sheep that has very fatty tail and produces a lot of wool, which up until 1980, the 1980s, before the collapse of the wool market, was really an important element in some of the additional income that they could bring in. But despite that market collapse, the herders were really attuned with their animals. They knew what their animals needed to eat at different times of the year. They needed what plants they needed to give them, and they also knew what kind of winter feed to give them. And a lot of the experts didn't engage with that knowledge, but rather tried to bring in new Western knowledge. So first there was an effort to improve the livestock, generally by bringing in Australian stock that really wasn't relevant to the region. And then also, because the area is very arid and the difficulties of always accessing water, being able to access water, and therefore in a way that was a control over where you moved your animals, development experts were also trying to introduce new plants. And I'm just thinking Atriplex, that keeps coming to my mind. David, you probably know this. And they were trying to persuade the Bedouin that this is what should be planted and this is what their animals should eat. And Bedouin response was, okay, it might be salt tolerant, but our animals drink more water if we give them this, and we're not really sure that there's a benefit. The knowledge of the local community was not really engaged with by government and therefore by development experts. And so there is what I see is the big problem is when we bring in Western expertise, that's great, that is a knowledge system, but it has to engage with local knowledge, and the two then have to somehow work with government. And I'm exaggerating a little bit, but what I find is a lot of government expertise in the Middle East, up until very, very recently, and that's being transformed with the way that we have knowledge being accessible through our modern media. But up until about 10 years ago, your experts in the ministries of agriculture, for example, in places like Syria, even Jordan, Lebanon, and I would imagine Saudi Arabia, were individuals who had had the opportunity to be trained in the 50s and 60s in the West. Most of them, when they came back to their countries, did not keep up with the changing and developing knowledge. So their knowledge was stuck in the 50s and 60s, and that is what they were continuing to promote. Out of date, out of touch, but it was a knowledge that they had. I think that's changing now with the way we have access to open access, et cetera. But it means that your government experts have to be rewarded for improving their knowledge and for continuing to update their knowledge. And that doesn't exist in a large part of the world. So the kind of socioeconomic perspectives, I think, are really important if we can find a way to bring our local knowledge, our traditional knowledge, to the front, side by Western knowledge, in debate and discussion with government before policy is determined.